I wanted to really quickly introduce Joe Hall, which is total pleasure, although last-minute duty, so apologies for not being over-rehearsed. I've known Joe for a long time. We were in grad school together at Berkeley while I was in law school. Joe was there getting his PhD. He was actually first prominent in my life and around the country for working on voting systems, electronic and online voting systems, and also voting machines and the security around them. And I think that was the focus of your dissertation, right?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so worked on that, and an election season couldn't go without Joe appearing on every various media outlet talking about it. And he's, of course, moved on from that into a broader range of work. He was a postdoc fellow at Princeton with Ed Felton, who is no stranger to policy and technology issues, and also worked with Helen Nissenbaum at NYU. And in the last year has come down to Washington, D.C., has joined the Beast, and now works at the Center for Democracy and Technology. He's their first ever, is that right, chief technologist?
Yeah, well, we had a chief computer scientist before me, but I didn't feel comfortable.
That's right, and computer scientist is too small of a title for Joe Hall, who's the chief technologist at the Center for Democracy and Technology, a fantastic online civil liberties organization and advocacy group. And also, just because at Google we love our well-roundedness, in addition to all the other things that he's done, Joe has also been a pastry chef, he has been a ranch hand, and he's also instructed yoga, been a lifeguard, and a riflery instructor for a youth camp. So there's, by the way, if the apocalypse occurs, I want this guy on my side. And with that, I want to pass it over to Joe Hall for a talk and hopefully some time for questions. If you have questions, please save them until the end. And also, if you are on GVC, please leave it muted to avoid further technology disruption. Thank you so much. Joe.
Thank you, sir. Yes. Oh. So I have quite a slide deck here for you. I think I'm going to try and go for 40 minutes, and I may skip over some things. And if I skip over something that's really true and dear to your heart or for some reason, let me know and we'll go back during Q&A. But I want to make sure there's plenty of time for Q&A. Q&A will not be recorded, so feel free to do whatever you want to do during Q&A. But so what I want to talk about here is tech policy, and specifically, so I've been in DC for a year now after leaving academia, and it's been a crazy year, man. And I just want to give you a flavor for how crazy it's been, for what's going on. And what I want to do is talk a little bit about the FBI and backdoors, the NSA and what we call the cryptopocalypse, and then novel technologies like drones. And I am the chief technologist at CDT, and we are hiring, by the way. Not that any of you should leave your wonderful jobs at Google, but please let your friends know that might be interested in this kind of stuff. Quick outline. So I think I got to tell you a little bit about who I am. Will did some of that. What is CDT? Some of you may have never heard of us. We're pretty low profile kind of an organization, and what I do. And then talking about how does tech policy work inside DC? How does anything about technology get done? Is it as frustrating as you may think it is here in Silicon Valley? And then walk through some of these specific case studies. So who am I? Well, I have a background in hard sciences. I did my undergrad at Northern Arizona University in Flagstaff, Arizona, where I modeled planetary atmospheres, which is a whole lot of fun. And we actually, oh, I see what's going on. We actually found clouds on a moon of Saturn called Titan that has sort of a methane cycle, just like the Earth has a water cycle with oceans and rain. And on Titan, they actually have that, but with something else. It's very, very cold. Anyway, that's just to give you an idea of some of the stuff I've done. I did I tend to tell people I hacked voting machines for my PhD. It's much more complicated than that. We were on the policy side of this stuff. We were funded by an enormous grant by NSF, a $10 million grant for 5 years, and to basically think about how do we make these black boxes a little more trustworthy. And we were invited, as you can see, we're invited to hack voting machines for the state of California. This is our current Secretary of State, Deborah Bowen. A lot of interesting people here: Matt Blaze, Alex Halderman, Deirdre Mulligan, Ping Yi, who is a Googler. I don't know if anyone else here is a Googler. Many of them have been interns. And you can see right here when we did it for Ohio on the right, this is resetting all the administrative passwords on this voting machine using a magnet and a Palm Pilot we just had sort of sitting around. Yeah, it's that bad, and it's actually kind of a little bit worse than that these days. The stuff that I work on regularly involves consumer privacy, health technology, national security, cybersecurity, and technical standard setting. I still do some e-voting and some space policy stuff. You can kind of think of me, this is why I call myself a technologist. I'm sort of half a lawyer and half a computer scientist, but my degree is from a school of information, so I have a PhD in information, of all things. But I say that because this is my PhD committee. Pam Samuelson was my PhD advisor on the left, then Deirdre Mulligan was my grant supervisor next to her. And those two are law professors. And then David Wagner at Berkeley was sort of the computer scientist, very, very well respected computer security guy. The guy I often say, what would David Wagner do when I do things? I may not do that thing, but I at least ask that question. And then Coy Cheshire on the far right, who does social psychology. So what is CDT? The Center for Democracy and Technology is a nonprofit think tank. We're a sort of half think tank, half advocacy outfit. We have a bunch of nerds and we do a whole lot of actual advocacy work in DC. We're about 20 years old. We used to actually be EFF's DC office, so the Electronic Frontier Foundation's DC office. There was a little bit of a falling out of sorts, and we broke off about 20 years ago. I can talk about that. What's our support come from? Largely foundations and corporate support. So not half and half, it's much more complicated than that. You can go to cdt.org financials and add it up yourself if you want to figure these things out. But this sort of underlines our principles, which involve, empowering people with digital technology and the internet. And this means that, we want to have things that are forward-looking, very progressive types of collaborative solutions, and tangible, pragmatic policy outcomes. And this often involves making sure we bring businesses into the conversation. We get a lot of flack for taking corporate money, but at the same time, we think that it's really a good idea. The internet doesn't just exist without, the economic case for doing things on the internet. And we think it's really important to make sure that that's done responsibly and that things don't chill that. And a lot of what we do is never public, which it's very hard to fund things with grant money, foundation money, when a lot of what you do is just not public. When it comes down to face-to-face meetings and stuff like that, you may not be able to say, here's a big press release, because it may deep six in entire relationships you have. It's important to think a little bit about what technology policy is. The basic way to say it is the rules that we set about technology. And it's not just laws. If you have two small kids arguing over a very large piece of cake, you can set up a really easy experiment because they both have the interest of getting the most cake, where one cuts it and the other gets to choose it, and that is essentially aligning incentives to get the best outcome, the outcome being both kids are somewhat convinced that they're happy and they participated in the process, so they know what's going on. But it's not just sort of social outcomes, it's also technical. So to what extent do the things we do result in better things happening, better technology being able to exist and thriving, and economic interest? To what extent does it help the country and other countries, build innovative products and employ people and things like that? This can mean that certain things are prohibited when you make rules about technology, and if you're a technologist, and I don't know how many of you in the room are, but maybe a lot of you, technologists can often be frustrated when someone tells them, oh, you can't do that. And so, for example, you cannot currently take satellite imagery that is lower than about 50 centimeter resolution. At least in the US, if you're a US company, you cannot put a satellite in the air and then sell the products that come out the other end. That means you guys at Google can't actually use products that have things that are lower than that resolution. There's currently a company, Globalize, currently petitioning the US government to be able to launch a satellite that would do that. And they're trying to make the case, look, there's not a lot more that's going to be able to, 25 centimeter resolution doesn't mean you're going to be seeing faces and things that might be problematic from a privacy perspective. Or particular installations, that's not going to make a big difference. Now, and we should also mention, we're going to be able to start doing things on the consumer end really soon that can be kind of scary, printing gun parts, printing molecules like sarin gas. How do you control that when it's a very cheap consumer technology? Can you control that? Do you have to resort to more informal methods of control like norms? Don't do sarin gas to your kids. I don't know. You also can't do certain things. Like, for example, you can go buy a pager right now, hack it, and eavesdrop on all the pager traffic around you. Very similar to plugging into an Ethernet port. If you have the right technical capabilities, you can read a lot of the traffic that's flying around. And your cell phone broadcasts stuff too. You can't just do those things, and maybe I'm preaching to the choir just because it's technically possible. There's reasons we have rules that make those things hard to do, or at least you disincentivize people doing that by punishing them later. So in DC specifically, and if you've been in DC for a while, you sort of know how this works, so feel free to go sleep for about 5 or 10 minutes. There's a various sort of constituencies and stakeholders that we work with to get things done. Congress is obviously a big one. Lately, not passing laws so much, but preventing bad laws from being passed. In Congress, there's all these support staff called staffers, legislative councils, various types of people. They're so key to talk with when you're in DC, in the sense that they're often the ones that not only do you have to explain very complicated topics to, but you have to explain them in a way that they can then explain them to their bosses. So it's not just, oh, I get it. It's about, no, look, this is exactly what you need to be able to say to your boss in order for them to have a hope of understanding what we're talking about. You do that sometimes through briefings. So you'll go in and talk to a single staffer or a whole bunch of them, or maybe a whole room like this full of staffers. And it's like pedagogy, in the sense you're teaching them something or trying to show them your way of view, but it's people who have maybe 30 minutes between one high-powered negotiating meeting where they're doing something on nuclear waste, and something else where they may be trying to get different kinds of visas for immigrant workers to come in. We do people will hand us bills and say, what do you think about this law that we haven't released yet? And we have to say, does it make sense for us to look at that, or should we throw it in the trash? Because the second you start working with people and saying, this is how the law should work, it becomes lobbying. When you start to work with the executive agencies or Congress about how laws should look and how they should pass and how this one's bad, or you really should add a feature like that to it, you're doing lobbying, and we are not registered lobbyists, so we have to, by law, keep it to about 20% of our total resource allocation, to be technical about it. The very, very high profile and valuable way to work with Congress is through testimony. So we are often at CDT asked to come in and testify, because a number of us have expertise in certain areas. But more often we say, look, you don't want us, you want someone else. You want Susan Landau, for example. You want Ed Felton, you want Ivy Rubin, you want whoever it is, Kevin Fu. You want some of these people to come in and talk to you about these things. That is a big goal of us in that process, is to make it really plug and play, to sort of have experts come in and, like I was telling Will over lunch and Troy that, you don't want to have to worry about printing 50 copies of some written testimony, which is what they ask you to do. Bring 50 copies of the thing you just spent, 2 days of your time writing with you. And you're like, wait, where am I going to do that? How am I going to do that? That sucks. It's heavy. What? So we do that, and we also will, do things like look at the testimony and say, that's going to, trigger someone's, other policy agenda on this side. They may have a dog in the fight on this other issue. And so we try and sort of make it to where experts want to come back and do this again. And that's hard to do, because sometimes people are like, I'm never setting foot back in Washington, D.C. after the grilling I got by that Congress member. That's, if that's the case, that's too bad. But we hope to make sure that, we have people come in regularly. We do work with the executive branch quite a bit. So this includes the White House and a slew of agencies. This is sort of like the alphabet soup slide. And there's some, unfortunately, this is not a technical alphabet soup, and so it's not as nearly fun as some of the ones later where I'll talk about technical stuff. But the White House has various sort of arms that we work with. The NSS stands for the National Security Staff, which has been a huge challenge lately. There's just a whole lot going on. And we'll talk a lot about that later. OSTP, the Office of Science and Technology Policy. We actually have, at least at the National Security Staff, we have a former CDT employee who's the head of the civil liberties and privacy part of that. And so he's extremely busy these days. And USTR, the US Trade Representative. How do we work with other countries, and how do we negotiate certain kinds of instruments that make sure that the U.S. is on an equal footing with other countries, or that things we care about are embodied in what we do. And that can be a challenge, because on the copyright side, the U.S. tend to be very, very aggro about, very, very aggressive about things, whereas what we want to see is, like, it's very hard to use IETF standards in Europe because they favor government-developed standards, not openly, open consensus kinds of flavors of standards. In terms of agencies, there's just a ton of them. Department of Commerce is pretty big, and we work a lot with them in order to say, here are the incentives involved in what we do. The NTIA, the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, is the White House's advisors in terms of internet policy, and so if you can convince some of them to care about your issue, then you're doing a good job. And again, one of CDT's former staffers, John Morris, is at NTIA, and NIST is what I've been doing a lot of lately. National Institute of Standards and Technology makes all sorts of standards about cryptography, computer security, cybersecurity, stuff like that. And this is all to say, there's a bunch of them: Federal Trade Commission, Federal Communication Commission, the Health and Human Services, the FDA, which is a part of the Health and Human Services in terms of medical device rules, Department of Transportation when it comes to drones, the Federal Aviation Administration. The thing that I want to get across here is, with regulatory proceedings, so these are things like RFIs, requests for information, ANPRMs, advanced notice of proposed rulemaking, NPRMs, notice of proposed rulemaking. These are extremely important for people to be involved with in your private capacity if you can, but it's very important to hear from industry and trade associations, blah, 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 whatever you want. RFIs are a way for an agency of saying, look, we have no clue what's going on here. We need some input. Please come to us and write a short little paper and tell us what's going on. ANPRM's, Advanced Notice of Proposed Rulemaking, says there's a law that says we have to write a rule about some subject. We're thinking about writing it like this, but we don't know if that's the right way to do it. Please come in and let us know if that's right. And then NPRM is like, okay, here's what we're going to do, because, and I should have said this earlier, but when laws get passed in Congress, they're typically very, very high level. They're typically, go do X, Y, or Z, and then you have to actually operationalize that. You have to go and write the specific rules down and get them passed such that that works. So, like, for example, healthcare.gov, there are a ton of really crazy, thousands of pages of rules that talk about how the exchanges work, how things are supposed to work. There's not a lot of information about the technical stuff in this, which is kind of a pain in the butt for those of us who need to, talk to the press or other people about why it's sort of failing so amazingly. And I'm not talking about that here. We can talk about that in Q&A. There's just some really horrible things going on. We also participate in workshops and proceedings. So I'm going to be speaking at a Federal Trade Commission workshop on the Internet of Things, which is I guess it's been a long, I was going to say it's a marketing term, but it's been along for a long time, so you can't just sort of write it off like that. But I'm talking about telehealth stuff on the 19th, and we'll see what happens. It should be pretty interesting. We don't do a lot of court stuff, like litigation. We very rarely do that. I think the last time we did it was something called Reno versus ACLU, which makes sure that it's about intermediary liability. This is why YouTube can have people come and put things up and not get in trouble themselves for things that people put up. We do file as amici, so amicus briefs, where that basically means a friend of the court brief, where we come in and we're not a party to the matter, but we want to say, look, these guys are duking it out, but we think you really need to care about something else that neither of them are going to tell you about, or they're not going to value as much as we do, like the public interest, for example. But we do, in litigation, support people, our partners, that are very, very, that do litigate and and are all over the place, like the Electronic Frontier Foundation, the ACLU, chapters in every state. Public Knowledge does a lot of copyright and intellectual property stuff. Press, so this is the last way that we work a lot with people in DC. Press is amazingly important and really effective when you do it well, and man, I have a lot of challenges with doing press well. I was on Glenn Beck has a cable news network, or cable network, called The Blaze, apparently. I didn't know this, but I was on it, and they really are on Obama's ass about the whole NSA thing, and they wanted to come in and someone to criticize it and say, why are they doing all these things? And we're like, we're happy to come and criticize it. We think it's wrong. It's not, a partisan thing at all. It's that you shouldn't collect that much stuff. But the disconcerting part about this is that, when I want to be doing a technical analysis or writing a paper or interfacing with someone to get something done, it can be like half of my day some days, especially if there's a Snowden revelation lately. I have to clear things for like about a day and a half. And it's just a pain in the butt, but you got to do it, or they never come again, which is not what you want. But it's really important because you have this core part of what people like me do, which is translation. I often have to talk to technical people about the law. Like, yeah, you did that, you can't do that, here's why you can't do that. Or talk to lawyers about technology. Here's how that thing, IPv6, works. Here's why you should care about it. Here's how you want to change what you're talking about and how you're writing about it. It can be a big challenge, and what I mean by that, so for example, here is a article from the other day where I was quoted talking about healthcare.gov. And the quote comes out, the beginning, and there's like 8 other people quoted in this article, but the first quote and the second one, if you can't read it, it says, some of these things are really amateur hour. This might just be an error, but you could also, well, you could not pass an undergraduate computer science class by making these mistakes. And it's very aggressive, and CDT doesn't tend to want to come off that aggressive, but at the same time, we were seeing things like refer headers leaked to Pingdom and doubleclick.net. So, and these refer headers had usernames and password reset codes in them. And it's this long URL with all these, ampersand encoded things in it, and we're just like, I don't know what any of that crap is, but that is bad, bad, bad. And you could not, that would be a fail in a web security class, right? And then at the very end, the problem is even when you get quoted, sometimes they don't get the quote right. You sort of have to live with it. So at the very end, it says, when it comes to functionality, the last thing you think about is security. And what being experienced in this kind of thing, what I tried to get across was people are trying to make things work. They don't think about the adversaries. They don't think about ways that people could mess with your stuff. And that's what I tried to get across. But now it makes it look like I'm saying, oh, security is the last thing you do. But I did follow up there by saying, look, you need to think about it. It's so deeply ingrained that you can't just add it on later. This is something that we've learned about over and over again from failures. You can't add it on later. DC, the last part, the most important part, and this is why it's so important that people like Heather West and others, various people, Pablo, all these people are in DC, if you've ever interacted with them, is because you have to meet with people face to face. You have to talk directly to other companies about things that you may find to be of common interest. And then trade associations, people who can sort of, like a union does, aggregate all of various companies in a sector to say things of real import. There's a whole bunch of other people we talk to. And to give you an example, this is the way that two things we really value at CDT are convenings and expertise. So we will often bring people together in a very closed door meeting, Chatham House rules, or something we even call stricter than Chatham House rules, and that means you can talk about the Chatham House is you can talk about what someone said there, but you can't attribute anything said to any specific person. The stricter than Chatham House rules is you can talk about what the meeting was about, but you can't talk about what anyone or any industry specifically said, and so it gets kind of weird. But we talked about, recently we had a convening on hack back. This is the idea of companies are getting attacked constantly, and they may want to take some measures to respond, and how far can they go? Right now, under the law, not very far. You can do pretty much anything you want inside your own network, but the second it leaves your network, there's not a lot you can do. And there's a really good book that I can refer you to about this stuff that's brand new, and it gives sort of a really neat framework to think about it. But the whole point of that convening was, what are people doing? What do they want to do? How would this be received by DC? What are some of the risks that could involve? If you take down a hospital and attacking back in middle of nowhere China or something like that, that's going to be really bad, and you don't want to have that kind of collateral damage, and that can happen because it's very hard to attribute things on the internet. It's very hard to know who you're actually interacting with. They could be coming through a hospital to attack you, and you never even know. Okay. So let's get into some of the cases here. First thing I'm going to talk about is the FBI and their quest to have more back doors into things. So in 1994, there was a law passed called CALEA, the Communications Assistance for Law Enforcement Act. And this was essentially the law enforcement community realizing that people are moving from regular landline phones that you could take 2 little alligator clips to and listen to what they're talking about if you get to the right little wire loop somewhere. There is increasingly digital switching. There was a whole bunch of new technologies that made it very hard to do wiretapping. And so they passed a law that said anyone who does telecommunications has to build and has to buy and has to build into these systems a way for us to actually wiretap people. And curiously enough, that did not apply to sort of the burgeoning internet at that time and the web, which is about to be born. And that's a very good thing, in our opinion. Now, fast forward to about 2010, the FBI started to argue via their general counsel, a woman named Valerie Caproni, who I think now works for Boeing, that they were, quote unquote, going dark. And what they argued is, geez, people aren't using, it's not just about the copper wire and the alligator clips anymore. People are not even using phones that much anymore. They're talking in ways to each other that don't even include telecommunications protocols at all. For example, if you think about webmail, like email, you may start your day off at your home answering some email. You may go to a coffee shop and answer some more email. If they want to wiretap you using the signals on the very end there, they have to actually, first of all, have a relationship with your internet service provider to do that. And if they're using Gmail, they will get entirely encrypted stuff because you guys use SSL. But if they're not, they're using someone else who doesn't do SSL. But then they have to figure out, okay, that's the coffee shop you went to, who's their ISP? I need to wiretap you there too. And so they're really worried about people sort of hopping around so much that they can't sort of do it in a turnkey manner. In fact, a number of people have argued sort of the opposite, that now, in this day and age, it's actually a golden age of surveillance. The more that we do every day and more of what we do every day is mediated by things that can record what we're doing. And there's so many signals being passed around that it's not so hard to imagine recording that stuff. And this is actually Peter Swire and Kanessa Ahmad wrote this for us. And it's a really neat, wonderful piece just to point to and say, look, in fact, it's not exactly this going dark problem. What we in fact have is more and more people collecting more and more stuff about what we do. Then around 2010, we started hearing grumblings about something that we're calling CALEA 2. And this is plugging this loophole in the original wiretapping law that would extend wiretapping obligations to software itself. And we think that is a horrifically bad idea. And some of these proposals would, basically require you to write software that was born with a wiretap capability in it, so born wiretap capable. And if you didn't do that, they would come to you and you'd get these escalating fine regimes. And it's actually totally, we heard some of these things were leaked in the press and they got pretty strange. Like the Washington Post claimed they would serve you with this thing saying you need to change your software to build in this wiretap capability, this backdoor into it. If you didn't do it, in 90 days, you'd get a $10,000 fine, and that $10,000 would be doubled every day indefinitely. And that's the kind of reaction I like to hear. It doesn't take very long to get to the entire market cap of most organizations or most businesses in some small countries. A couple of weeks is all you need of that kind of a thing to totally wipe someone out. So then the next leak, about a week or two later, it was, this is going to be $25,000 a day and it's going to be additive. And I'm like, okay, at least then I can start seeing you making a case that this is just the cost of business if you're going to do secure communications. But in the end, we really don't think that there should be any law that outlaws purely encrypted end-to-end communication systems, which sounds like what this would do, sort of require you to serve clear text to people. So we've been hearing about this and we're like, okay, what can we do here? And this is one of the key ways that we operate. We organized an expert report. So we got a bunch of extremely smart people together. We wrote a sort of draft and said, what do you guys think about this? How can we make this better? And involved sort of a curated list of 20 of the top cryptography, computer security, and network security experts in the world. One of which is sitting in this room, Susan. But this is a really interesting list of people, and this is curated in a way that it's not sort of simply people that everybody would recognize. So there's people on here that are definitely have cachet. So the Peter Neumans, Edward Feltons, Phil Zimmerman, who created PGP, was involved with this. But there's sort of young people and people that keep a low profile. So Eric Rescorla, who now works at Mozilla. Fred Schneider, a very, very smart professor at Cornell who was on the, I believe the Air Force Defense or one of the Defense Advisory Boards. So very, top secret cleared individual who was willing to make this argument. Anyway, so a whole bunch of really, Matt Green, who's probably one of the most accomplished and promising young applied cryptographers. And feel free to take issue with any of this in the Q&A. But our argument was relatively simple. We talked about a few things. We said that architected vulnerabilities, what you're asking, these backdoors just fundamentally undermine security. These are, when you engage in communications, these are things that are designed to undermine your ability to speak privately and securely with someone. And it's designed to do so in a way that is undetectable, which is fundamentally a problem. And that these things are backdoors, these kinds of backdoors in endpoint software and products are really difficult and messy. And so for example, if you do say, okay, FBI tells me via this law we have to build a backdoor into what we're doing, how do you manage that? How do you manage access to that? If you get a valid law enforcement request from Iran or from China, what do? Do you say, okay, well we have a business case that we're not going to do that or whatever, or you get one from a police officer in a tiny town and somewhere in America, and you may not be technically, especially if you're a mom and pop shop, you may not have the capability to sort of understand what's going on there or the desire to think about those kinds of things. And the sort of slam dunk argument, it's always good to have one of those, is that this is just not going to work. If you put backdoors in these products, a lot of them are open source. Chrome, Firefox, you can see these things, rip them out. OpenSSL. The things that are not open source, you can have binary patches. That's what a jailbreak is a binary patch to something to make it do something else. And finally, you could actually procure this stuff in some country that doesn't have a stupid law like that. So it doesn't make any sense to do any of this. We took a small group of these people, so Ed Felton, Bruce Schneier, Eric Rescorla, and Micah Scher, a former student of Matt Blaze, who's now a professor at Georgetown, to the White House and the Department of Commerce. The Department of Commerce was very much sort of, it felt like they wanted ammo to try and shoot these kinds of things down, whereas in the White House it was very clear that they were sort of listening but not playing any of their cards or showing us anything. They didn't really make any commitments. They didn't seem to be very shocked. I think this is sort of something they'd expected and heard before. Now, the key part of this, and it's something that I have to emphasize, is that this is only the first part of the battle against the FBI in terms of backdoors. It didn't deal with centralized services. Our argument was all about endpoints. And unfortunately and sadly, if you as someone in the middle have clear text, if you have access to the stuff, you can be compelled to give it over. And so, there's examples. Hushmail about 10 years ago, LavaBit most recently shut itself down rather than give up 400,000 of its users to the I believe the FBI. We're going to need help making these arguments about centralized services. For example, how does lawful intercept undermine security? I need to be able to make that argument sometime in the future, not anytime really soon. But I think this underlines that, especially at CDT, and I think hopefully people in this room agree that you can't tap everything. That technically there will be something that you cannot listen to. I think there's a lot of interest these days in the venture capital community about end-to-end secure communication tools of various types. There's just a ton of action there, and that was before Snowden. That was a thing before Snowden. It's definitely bigger now. This may sound kind of sci-fi, but it's true. We will have things you put in your head to support, computationally support cognition at some point in the future. Maybe it's farther away than some people think, but who knows? It's going to happen. that stuff should not, you should have an enclave inside your head that you can keep your secrets to yourself, right? I mean, that we need some sort of, I don't know what we need. We need something that basically makes that happen. So that was all in play, and then Snowden happened. That was May 16th when we wrote that, and then June 4th is when Snowden happened. And so we transition into another case study, the cryptopocalypse, and I have to go a little bit faster here. And what I mean by the cryptopocalypse, so cryptography involves math that is hard. So math that you can do easily in one direction, but is very hard to do in the other direction, like really hard, like billions of years of computational power hard. This year has been, since June, a real pain in the butt for some of us, just because every week you get this new revelation and we have to make sense of it. We have to make sure that we have a policy response, we got a press response, blah, blah, blah. But for now, I'm going to focus on two things. I need to move a little quicker than I thought, but Bull Run and something called Muscular. Bull Run is essentially the NSA's program and the GCHQ, the UK version of the NSA, the Global Government Communications Headquarters. It's not a very descriptive title, but they're using tricks, as Bruce Schneier says, to undermine security. They are either stealing or compelling people to write certificates for them, SSL certificates. You can think of it as stealing encryption keys or compelling people to give you the keys. It seems like they're planting moles in internet and technology companies. So someone in this room may be paid by the NSA in addition to be paid by Google, who knows? And we've seen some companies actually institute military security protocols to where very sensitive things are handled by two people, and you're hopeful that not both those people are a mole. And they've been planning backdoors and standards, and sort of when someone comes with a set of source code to the NSA and says, please help us evaluate this implementation of a cryptography product, they will say, oh, here's a couple of things we found that were problems, here's a couple of vulnerabilities, and they're also keeping some for themselves to use later. And Muscular, you may all know about. They're up on your data center traffic, apparently. And they're using this sort of lack of constitutional oversight in foreign countries to tap that traffic. Obama, at some point, realized that this wasn't going to stop and decided he'd put a panel to study the thing and tell him what he should do. We were all a bit disappointed to see that it was essentially all law professors and all insiders, so everyone who had some sort of involvement with the Obama administration. Although Peter Swire is one of them, and Peter Swire, if any of you know him, is awesome. And he wrote that thing about the golden age of surveillance, definitely a skeptic about surveillance. CDT, Dan Auerbach, if you knew him, I think he used to be a Googler. And EFF, we basically responded in a public comment kind of form. So not, this is an expert report that we're going to put up here, but this is sort of an argument that we want to make that a lot of people believe in. And 47 people signed on to it. You probably can't read this, but there's a lot of really neat people here. I'm going to bring your attention. We're trying to continue to sort of bring in a bunch of different kinds of people. So there are some Ross Anderson and Stephen Farrell are both UK-based security experts of various types. Joan Feigenbaum, we have some sort of theoretical crypto kind of people and people who do sort of bigger thinking, and a whole bunch of scrappy activists, Ashkan Soltani, Runa Sandvik from the Tor project, although they didn't list that affiliation here. Morgan Marquis Boire, who affiliation here is Citizen Lab, but he is a Googler, very, very smart guy. We made the following argument, which is that if you're gonna have a secret court that's gonna look at technical topics, you need that secret court to have someone with technical expertise on it to evaluate the arguments that are being made. Not only that, but we pointed out how not having a technical person in the room for this stuff resulted in a massive overcollection of surveillance data in the past. Specifically with something called MCTs, multi-communications transactions. That's like they grabbed a Gmail screenshot as it flies by, and so it has a bunch of to and from email traffic on it. One of those may be a foreign person, which means they can keep it. But all the rest aren't, and they claim that it's not technically possible for them to sort these things out, which is bullshit, because if you look at the JSON structure for that, you could very easily grab just what you wanted. And there's other things like call detail records, which they're grabbing all of our call detail records every day in the US. Apparently at one point they include cell towers. They don't now, they tell us. I don't know how we're supposed to know that for sure, but at some point they did. Because when the cops come and ask a telecommunications carrier for call detail records, they typically get the cell towers you connected to when you made calls. That's very easy and increasingly easier to use to pinpoint your location throughout the day. We talked about wholesale attacks. These are non-targeted. You're weakening everyone's security. But I think the most important argument that we made that got Ross Anderson and Stephen Farrell on, this is something that we're going to be making a lot more noise about very soon, is that the U.S.'s commitments to civil liberties and privacy really demand that we treat non-U.S. persons' data with respect. And we can't just sort of say, oh, they're foreigners, we can do anything we want to them. That is just totally offensive. And it's especially offensive to anyone who runs a global internet business. Part of these revelations revealed that the NSA is doing some things that it's kind of hard to tell exactly what they're doing, but it seems to be clear that they planted a backdoor, or that there may be a backdoor. We don't know for sure. And this particular thing called dual EC DRBG, it's a random number generator. In cryptography, we have to generate a lot of random numbers very quickly. You can't just use dice. It would take you forever and it would not be fun. But NIST actually, when they heard about this, thought long and hard about it for a few days and then said, please don't use this thing. We think there's a problem with it. If you think there's a problem with it, let us know. Please don't use this thing. And then you saw RSA Security, which makes a lot of libraries for cryptography products, issue a product recall. The first product recall I know of, and I'd love to be proven different, where it was essentially someone recalling a product because their own government had sort of hacked their stuff. That was not a good thing to see. The fact that they had been accused of or it was unclear that they had inserted a backdoor in this one random number generator caused people to start looking around other things, and this curious case of SHA-3 came around. SHA-3 is a hash standard, so something used to make cryptographic hashes. This is a 5-year competition to develop or to replace SHA-1. SHA-1 is based on this way of doing hashes that had been attacked, and was basically everyone thought that at some point it will fall entirely and you won't be able to use any of this stuff anymore. They won the competition in October of 2012, this one called Ketchak. It's a really fascinating thing. I can talk about more if you want to hear about it. It turns out it was modified after the competition by NIST before it wrote it up into a long, boring document that says, if you're going to build something that does this, here's how you do it. And a lot of people are like, why did you modify that? Why did you reduce the security of it? And a number of different arguments. So when I heard about this, first of all, I tried to make sense of it. And so I wrote up a little blog post that basically said, what the heck is going on with SHA-3? And I figured the cryptographic community isn't that big. Nerds who care about this, there's not that many of them. I put this up, it totally took our server down. I don't know what it was. Maybe, part of the problem is because of who we are, we don't drop cookies and we don't drop locally stored objects, which means we can't use things like Cloudflare to sort of, and I can talk more about that. But anyway, so it brought our thing to its knees and we're like, oh geez, people care about this. I met with the White House, 2 people at the White House, Tim Polk and Ari Schwartz, and we're really concerned about this. Why don't you just standardize the thing that won the competition? It looks bad if you don't. Turns out that resonated, and in fact, SHA-3 is now going to be standardized in its as won in the competition form. It's going to have all the strong security. I mean, this is like pre-image collision like 2 to the 500. It's just so enormously and huge. It'll probably be a very long time before anyone actually cracks it. But the whole point was have a really strong one for people who do really crazy things like elections. You often need, for certain kinds of mixed nets, you need a whole lot of collision resistance. Anyway, but NIST is also doing some review of their entire cryptographic standards suite. Let's talk about drones. So drones are really interesting because it's sort of a novel technology. It's not like something before it. It's really new in DC, and I'll try and be really quick here. They have a whole lot of promise. 100% of crop dusting is done in Japan with drones, unmanned aircraft. And the whole point is crop dusting is extremely dangerous. You often have wind breaks at the end. You're really low, and if you don't pull up quick enough, you hit a bunch of trees and you die, and it's horrible. It's useful for a whole bunch of things. There is a very serious potential for abuse with unmanned systems, especially these kinds of systems. They're really tiny. You often hear them before you see them. They're very, very cheap. So right now you can get one for about $300, a quadricopter from Parrot. There are no humans on board, and that's a good thing, but it means that they can go places that planes can't. So it can go between buildings, and it can do things that planes can't do. It can handle crazy G-forces. It can be up, some of these things can stay aloft for many, many days, weeks in some cases. These are gas-powered, obviously not battery-powered. And they're going to very soon have all the kinds of surveillance packages that manned aircraft have. Gigapixel cameras, so being able to get centimeter resolution, like a place like Manhattan, could be very useful for a variety of things. LiDAR, laser kinds of things can see through foliage and image what's behind sort of diffuse kinds of barriers. Synthetic aperture radar can see through your drapes at home, and it can tell if something in your front lawn has moved a couple centimeters and things like that. And these aren't things that people really understand, or we should understand, or should begin to understand. The FAA has to integrate drones into the national airspace by 2015, and they're going through a regulatory process to do that. We're really thinking a lot about privacy and safety for drones. How do other aircraft know what's around them? If you've ever flown aircraft, birds are a real problem. Well, think of these as metal and plastic birds that are flying around that you might smack into. And how do people in their backyard get an idea of what's in the sky above them? We imagined a pretty simple analogy. For vehicles, some of this stuff works with just a license plate. The license plates aren't there just for the cops. It's for you too. Someone does something, or if you need to, someone left their lights on. There's a whole bunch of uses for the sort of a meat space cookie for vehicles. And planes have something similar in terms of an N number on their fuselage or their tail. So I thought, what about a license plate for drones? Well, an N number is way too damn tiny. You'd need like a telescope to be able to visualize that, and that's not going to work. So what about a radio frequency license plate? What if you broadcast an identifier? So I wrote this thing. It was kind of, I hadn't thought about this much. I didn't know anything about flight regulations. We got a lot of feedback, and they clued us into this thing called ADS-B out, Automatic Dependent Surveillance Mode B out. This is essentially a radio frequency standard required by the FAA for all aircraft by 2020. It broadcasts an identifier, position, velocity, altitude every couple of seconds. And it's used on manned aircraft to sort of replace, when you do radar, you get an echo back from every sweep, and you have to extrapolate where the plane's going, how fast it's going, where it currently is, and you have a very big error radius on that value. If it knows where it is and it tells people where it is, and it's a very precise type of thing, you can actually reduce that error radius and pack planes in for landing a whole lot quicker. This is sort of how it works. The planes have very fine GPS, or GLONASS, it's the Russian version of GPS. And then they broadcast this stuff, and other planes can see them, and ground-based receivers can see them too. We basically said, okay, FAA, you need to have a registry that has who owns, UAS is another word for drone, ask me why later. You need to talk about what kind of thing this is, what kind of airframe type, what weight does it have, what's its wingspan, how big is it, and then it needs to have a data collection statement that says, here's all the stuff that we want to do, here's what we're going to collect, here's who we're going to share it for, here's how long we're going to keep it, here's someone to talk to if you get upset. And you should issue something called a Mode X hex code, Mode S hex code, which is the thing you broadcast on your airplane. It's a 24-bit identifier. And then a U number, sort of like a N number, something that's a human friendly. You could think of that as IP address and domain name if you want to. We said everyone should have to broadcast this thing, but it's unclear if it should have to be from the airframe or from the ground. And the whole idea here is that both people in aircraft and people on the ground can in real time see what drones are doing. And the FAA, or you could have a Google Drones that sort of showed where all the drones were in a given area. In fact, you could buy stuff that does this now, because some companies are already have their planes outfitted to the 2020 standard. So you can go for $900, buy this little antenna that hooks up to your iPad. For some reason, they only work with iPads. I'm not sure why. Maybe they just want to support one platform. Here's another one from Garmin, a little bit cheaper. You can use these in planes. Maybe that's why, because a lot of the flight plan software is iPad-based. Oops. Since we said this and since we said that, the FAA responded and said, oh, we don't care. which is too bad. But there's been a lot of other interest in this, and I think the FAA may actually mandate this. There are a lot of complications. If you want to have these things on aircraft, you need a flight certified GPS, which is really expensive, and you have to have a transponder. So this is what these things look like. They have a human interface, which you don't need for a drone. And that hardware box is about the size of a pack of cards, so it's not that big. And you probably can't read this, but I actually wrote these guys at Trig, our avionics, that make that thing. And it's like, hey, how much does this cost? I said, we're actually outfitting these things on drones that have to operate in airspace that require this right now. It's about $6,000. So if you have a $300 drone, in order to play, maybe you have to spend $6,000 to get it up. Maybe that's okay. Maybe that raises the barrier high enough to where not everyone will have one. I don't know. Anyway, that's it. Sorry, I went way over.